Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on this beautiful afternoon, especially since it is so beautiful. You could be out there walking on the promenade, the Eastern Prom or something, but thank you for coming here to join us this afternoon for the University of New England's annual P.D. Merrill Lecture in Business Ethics. This is the 11th year of this program, and it encourages us to reflect on best practices in business and ethics in particular, but broadly determined. I didn't personally have the pleasure of knowing P.D. Merrill, but I certainly have heard many, many stories, many wonderful things about him since coming to UNE, and it has been my pleasure to meet Sandy, and then just today I got to know Ethan a little bit, and learning about all the things he's doing with the new Sailbot, which I want to hear more about, and other things. And so I just want to let you guys know that PD's legacy lives on and his spirit lives on through this program. And I very much appreciate your support for allowing us to continue with this program. I'd like to welcome everyone in attendance, including our students, our UNE students and students from elsewhere, as well as our friends from other academic institutions. My friend Glenn Cummings is here from the University of Southern Maine and others, and I just appreciate everybody coming out to join us this evening. And students in particular, I hope that you will take today's talk in the context of our tagline, our motto here at UNE, Innovation for a Healthier Planet. And I think those few words really encapsulate all that we try to do in our various clinical and research and academic programs here. And I hope that you take the time to reflect on people like P.D. Merrill and people like Mr. Roux, who I'll tell you a little bit about shortly, and the lessons that they can impart, not just in the specific content, but in the broader themes of what you're going to hear today. So it's my great honor to introduce David Roux. So David is for those of you that don't know, I suspect many people in the room already know who he is and he needs no introduction, but he is the chairman of Jackson Labs and chairman of the board of Jackson Labs, which of course is America's leading biomedical research laboratory and one of the leading laboratories in the world of its kind. Earlier in his career, he was a pioneer in the tech industry. In fact, I think if you had to count on your hand, the 5 people who really led to the digital revolution, he would be on that list. His first company, his first venture, was starting the very first CD-ROM library. And when he sold that business and moved on, he did a number of other things. He worked as an executive at a number of different places, including Lotus and Oracle and other well-known companies. He then, in 1999, started Silver Lake, and Silver Lake is the global leader in capital for digital projects and digital innovations. And he's invested in countless companies and has directed those. And he likes building things. He likes building, that's where really his passion is. And he's very, very innovative in being able to figure out good ideas and to really leverage them and build something special. He has deep Maine roots. Dave is from Lewiston originally and still has a home in Harpswell, so here in Maine, and he comes up frequently. And so he's very well connected to Maine. And I'm also happy to say that his niece, Sierra, is a UNE freshman who plays on our basketball team. So he even has a direct UNE connection in that regard. After growing up in Maine in the 60s and 70s, he went to Harvard College. He then went to King's College at Cambridge, and then eventually went back, got his MBA at Harvard again. And it's been my pleasure to get to know him a little bit and his wife, Barb, and I'm just absolutely fascinated by his insights. He was gracious enough this afternoon to spend time with a number of our students in our business program and just answering their questions and sharing his wisdom. And it was really, I learned a lot just by listening to that, and not to mention other conversations I've had with him. So this afternoon, Dave is going to present a talk that should be very interesting based on the title alone, which is Social Trauma, Technology, Tsunamis, and Other Dangerous Consequences of Higher Education. So I think we're all going to learn a lot. So without further ado, thank you very much. Dave.
President Herbert, thank you very much for that very kind, overly generous introduction. It's always great to be back in Maine. As Jim pointed out, I grew up in Lewiston, went to Lewiston High School, as did all 5 of my siblings. I'm on the board at Bowdoin, chairman at Jackson Bar Harbor. I'm an investor in Bristol Seafoods, which large fish company down on the Portland waterfront, run very ably by my son-in-law, Peter Handy. And perhaps most importantly, my wife and I, my wife who's here tonight, Barb Roux, we have 3 grandchildren. Our daughter living up in Yarmouth, so we have lots and lots of Maine connectivity, and we love being up here. Now, Jim has asked me to speak about major new technology trends and how those trends affect us and our society. Kind of a lofty, maybe even overly grand notion, as befits a college president. In thinking about it, I thought, how could I just be a little bit provocative, which is why I'm calling the talk Social Trauma, and particularly emphasizing the dangers and the social consequences of these big trends. We have a tendency to focus on all the positives, and there are many of those. There are also some very important issues to manage that always come with important new technology trends, none more so than we're living with today. Let me start, if I could, with 3 things you may find surprising. And I am going to submit that they apply to all major new technology trends. First thing is that all important new technology trends are not new. There has never been an important new technology that took less than 20 or 30 years to show up. It may have seemed new to you when you read about it or you bought the first product, but I guarantee you, anything truly important has been around for 20 or 30 years, and very often it takes 50, 60, or 70 years for a really important trend to make its way through into the market and then to reach its full market potential. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The second thing, as a business person, slightly embarrassing to admit, all major new technologies have been accompanied by an embarrassing assembly of crooks and financial misadventures by investors, all of whom should know better. 100% of the time. The third thing is that historically, this is the part where Jim is asked to cover his ears, historically, all the most important entrepreneurs and inventors have been almost completely uneducated, none of whom really had degrees, none of them had advanced degrees, and more incredibly still, most of them were completely inexperienced and totally unqualified for the CEO jobs they ended up holding at the companies for which they became famous. It's an interesting question for us, which I'm going to return to at the end of the talk, about how important this higher education thing really is. The story has a happy ending, so you don't have to be on the edge of your seat. But suffice to say, it hasn't been so important up until now. Now, it's tempting to think of technology as this sort of disembodied waves of innovation that come rolling in from out west, crashing in from California, crashing in from China, and all of a sudden left behind on the beach are all these wonderful new products and capabilities, right? We get fancy new iPhones, we get electric cars, we get solar panels, we get wonder drugs, all of which seem to be arriving like a cargo cult, right? Just sort of drop down upon us. And that would be your sort of sense that it's some natural phenomenon that has brought these all to us. And yet, it's important to unpack that because that couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, the innovation process is incredibly organic. And in particular, what's important to remember is that those products are the results of inventions by people just like you and me. They were built by regular companies, and those companies delivered those products with employees employed in our normal economy. In other words, the products are special, but how we got them isn't really that different. Regular folks, regular companies, normal economy. And so it begs the question, why is it that some of these inventions become these incredible platform technologies that are so incredibly transformative, and others are boring fads, they come and go? How do we know the difference? And can we tell, and particularly, can we tell in advance? Either because we're investors, and that would be really handy if you're an investor to know something's going to be important in advance, or because you're a young person looking to build a career, or because you're a regulator or a politician looking to tax that future industry, or kind of keep a handle on it, right? Any of those might be reasonable reasons to have a point of view about what's coming next. It turns out that the introduction of these new technologies follow a very predictable pattern. And what's interesting is that the first thing I always tell people is that really important products always make you either happy or healthy. People tend to get distracted. Investors, pundits, commentators, by talking about the whiz-bang technology. Particularly true out in the valley. Or, on Wall Street, they get all wrapped up in the excitement of the finances. How fast it's growing, how profitable it is, how wonderful the margins are going to be, how transformative and how huge the marketplace could be. And those are things that tend to take you away from the true story, which is answering the question if you can answer the question, who really loves this shiny new thing that just showed up? Because the heart, the beating heart of any truly transformative technology is demand. Somebody needs or wants that thing more than any other thing that's out there, right? So demand is the kind of key driver. Otherwise, all you end up with is a fad. So when you think about somebody buying something, what you have is not, it's because when you buy something, you do it with money, and because money is easy to track, it tends to fall into a financial transaction. That's how people keep score. But really, the introduction and diffusion of new technology is primarily a psychological and social thing. The money is a little bit of a sideshow, right? Investors keep track, but really it's a little bit of a sideshow. What is important, if you think about it, is how do you get new technology out there and make it stay? Well, first of all, real people need to know about it. Real people need to buy one. Real people need to service it. Real people need to tell their friends about it. Real people need to make accommodations in how they work or how they live to use the technology. And then finally, real people need to like it enough that they keep using it. They form a habit around it. And then enough people need to have that experience that there's scale, which is the thing that makes the new technology and the trend large and important and durable. So, I said before that it's not really financial, but what really makes these big transformations unique is the fact that they come with these large, highly visible social phenomena. And in particular, there is always a biblical scale plague of charlatans, scammers, and crooks, right? Think of Bitcoin today, right? Think of all those cryptocurrencies, every single one of them. Crooks and charlatans and people stealing money, right? And by the way, it has been true for every major technology trend that has happened. Think today, just think last month about Mark Zuckerberg testifying before Congress about a complete and total privacy breakdown and the hacking of our 2016 presidential election. Right? Technology, even good technology, they've got 2 billion people using that product worldwide. It's a gigantic business. It's enormously successful. And it's almost entirely out of control. Right? And so the benefits and the effects are not always benign. In fact, I will go further than that. I will say that if you look back 300 years, go back 3 centuries, every single new major technology trend has been accompanied by a stock market mania, investor scams, dizzying market crash, investor losses, bankruptcies, unemployment, labor dislocation, and regret. Even, or especially for the most successful technologies. I know you're all sitting there saying, oh, come on, can't possibly be true. But let's just look at a few. I'm just going to take you through a few examples. And I'm going to give you 3. They're all 3 different centuries, 3 different scientific underpinnings, 3 different physical technologies, but remarkable similarities. In the 18th century, think about it, right? Beginning of the Industrial Revolution in England, textile industry is totally rocking. What is the #1 most advanced technology, the most highly engineered product in the world at that time? Canals. Think about how you move products, right? There were no highways. There were no railroads. So the way you would move raw materials and finished goods to market is on a path. You'd haul it on a horse. Well, it turns out when you put a canal in, the canal is, depending on what you're hauling and for how far you're hauling it, it will be 10 to 20 or 20 to 30 times more efficient. Dramatic improvement. 1763, a guy named Bridgewater built the first major successful canal to haul coal into the center of Manchester to power these mills. He spent a fortune on it, and it was super highly engineered. It was like a moonshot, right? They had to dig the canals. Remember, there's no power, right? They're not doing this they're not blasting power, blah, blah, blah. They have to dig the canals. They've got the hydraulics associated with that. They have the locks, they have the bridges, and they have the aqueducts, because they have to take it over all kinds of things to get it there. Okay, it's huge, complicated, super expensive. You get it there, and the result of which is, in 1763, that he halved the cost of coal coming into Manchester, while at the same time dramatically increasing his own profitability, which tells you that transportation was the biggest cost to running that business. Totally transformed the mills in Manchester, made them much more competitive, and guess what? People did. People looked around and said, whoa, canals, how about that? And do you think the next year that people built a lot of canals? No. People thought about it. I don't know if that's going to work. What do you think? Maybe you got lucky. 60s go by, 70s go by, not a whole lot going on, until he's making so much money. There are a few other random canals. People start going to Parliament to ask for more canals. You have to get a charter from the government to do it. By 1790, there's a frenzy of canal building. 20 new canals. And what do we have? Formation of 20 new companies to build canals. Stock market boom. Dizzying increase in the price of these canals. And in 1793, what happened? Stock market crash. Boom, it all came down. No one built any more canals. But during that period of time, during the frenzy, right, the price of the Maine Canal Company went from £100 to 473 pounds in the space of a year. Right? Huge run-up, like the Tesla of its day. And then, boom, crash back down below. And so what's interesting is that during this period of time, they built, during this 1 3-year period, 1790 to 1793, during the boom, when all the investors lost money, when all these scams were going on, they built 4,000 miles of canals, all of which are still there, and all of which were really the underpinning for the transportation logistics infrastructure for the Industrial Revolution. And it all went fine. So in other words, it kept going after the crash for another almost 40 years. All through the 1790s, early 1800s. And by the way, there was not a canal boom in the United States. It took a little while to get it across the ocean. Guess what happened here? Can you guess? Exactly the same thing, which is they built the Erie Canal, which was the first one, Erie to the Hudson. And everyone said, fantastic. And guess what we did? Same thing. Within 3 years, we built 3,300 miles of canals. We had a boom, we had a crash, too many companies formed, investor losses, whole thing. Exactly the same thing that happened. And if you take it from the beginning, if you go back to that point where Bridgewater built the first canal to when the kind of canal boom finally ebbed, reached its market potential, people stopped building, they stopped creating new canals, 70 plus years. And that, you would say, oh, well, that was, that's because it was 300 years ago. Of course they were inefficient. They didn't know how to get technology out and around. Well, why did people stop building canals? People stopped building canals because of railroads. Exactly. Because the railroad came along, and while the canals were 10 to 30 times better than hauling something on a horse, a railroad was more than 10 times better, in some cases up to 100 times better, depending on the distance and the load and what you had to do, than a canal. Canals were devastating, right? And along they came. Now, in the UK, you got the first stuff coming in the 1820s, and it really came around, and this is often the case where you have three not so obviously related things come together and it clicks. And those things were flanged wheels, locomotives, and steel track, right? Those things came together to make the powered, regularly scheduled, highly reliable steam locomotive thing. That had cog railways, that had other kind of small scale rail stuff before. In fact, that had rails where you'd haul it along with a horse, right? Kind of on tote paths, just like you would a canal. First line was Liverpool and Manchester. Started carrying freight in 1830. Momentum built through that period, and guess what happened? 1844 to 1846, 2 years, several hundred railway companies were formed. They applied for 10,000 miles of track. They actually built 6,200 miles of track, which, by the way, today, if you think about it, 1844 to 1846, in 2 years, they built 6,200 miles of track, which is over half of all the track that exists in the United Kingdom today. Got built in that one little window, which was the middle of a crazy mania where prices exploded, too many companies, huge scam. In fact, the guy who was Mr. Railway, they called him the Railway King, George Hudson, when the market crashed, had to flee the country because of investment fraud. Turned out what he had been doing was paying new investors with money, paying old investors with money raised from new investors. He was Ponzi before there was a Ponzi, right? But the guy built a lot of track. Okay, so come by and you say, really, it's the same pattern. You have this precursor innovation, you have a first commercial application, public enthusiasm, a burst of unsustainable new company formation, financial mania, eventual stock market collapse, horrific losses, unemployment, dislocation, blah, blah, blah. But that happened about 20 years in, and then guess what happened? 50 more years of slow build-out of the rail system in the UK, US, and around the world. My third example is the electrification of our own country. And although the bulk of the activity took place around the turn of the century and in the early years of the 20th century, it really started with Edison, Thomas Edison, demonstrating the first long-lasting working light bulb on New Year's Eve in 1879. People were amazed. And what he said when he did that, all right, if you think about it, he has an electric light bulb, but there's no electricity. So how useful is that? Not very useful at all, right? And he said, when he introduced it, because he was one of the great salesmen and hucksters of the period. Think of him as the Elon Musk of the late 19th century, right? What he said was, we are going to make electricity. Because people said, hey, Mr. Edison, the light bulb was great, but I don't have any electricity at my house. In fact, there's no electricity in my city. In fact, there's no electricity in our country. How do I use your invention? He says, don't worry. I am going to make electricity so cheap that only rich people will have candles. That was the famous quote from Edison. And the next year, he started an electricity company. Right? He built the first power plant in, it was in New York City. And what happened is that all kinds of trouble ensued, right? Even though we know the story turns out okay, because we all have electricity, what initially happened is a giant standards war, fights with the gas company because they said, oh my gosh, this is way better than gas. We need to sit on this guy's head. There was no shortage of crooked politicians, and there was competition from Westinghouse and then the company that eventually became General Electric. Turns out Edison had bet on DC, direct current. The other team had alternating current. And what do you all have in your house today? AC. You all have alternating current. So Edison, who thought this invention up, who pioneered and built the first power station, who spent millions of dollars of his own money, was eventually fired from his own company. Run out, the DC thing lost as a standard, and what happened was that alternating current became the whole story, right? That's what won. And does anyone have an idea about what happened? What happened is that there was another confluence of activity, right? So it took a little while for that battle to play out. And around the turn of the century, first in the aughts and then in the teens, became the roaring 20s, you had not just electricity, but that ushered in the availability of railroads. You also had at the same time steel, and you had automobiles. All of these things happening at the same time, and we had the mother of all market manias all happening at the same time. We had 4 or 5 big technology trends all kind of collapse on themselves. We have this huge run up, and by the way, made worse by easy credit, a financial innovation, unwelcome financial innovation, all right? And then, of course, we have the Great Depression, and it was horrifically bad, but it is exactly the same thing that we saw with railroads. It is exactly the same thing that we saw with canals. Now, as wonderful as it was, it's instructive to think it took 4 decades, to the mid-1920s, before half of America had electricity. Now, when do you think it was obvious this electricity thing was going to be useful? Think it was obvious in 1890, 1900, 1910, 1915, 1920? All of those times, less than half of America had electricity. Do you think it was a big insight to say, hey, I think this electricity thing's here to stay? It's good work. Right? Doesn't burn my house down. It's not stinky like gas. Cheaper than candles. My point to you is that it was obvious for a very long time that this was the winning technology. It was going to be here for a long time. And by the way, it took another decade to get to 70%. It wasn't until 1930 that you got 70% of the population with electricity. And so you have the same story as railroads, the same story as canals, and remarkably, each of those trends took about 20 years to develop into a mania, 20 to 25, from the first commercial offering to the mania. And then it took another 50 to 60 years after that for the technology to reach full diffusion, full level of market potential. Now, what ended up happening in the end is you end up with a few dominant companies. They have a working technology, you have reliable products, superior business models, you've got compelling value proposition for customers, and the simple way to say it is the few people got rich, most people lost money through this whole mania because they figured out what was the best thing for the most people. By the way, not always playing fair or being wholly legal along the way. Right? These battles are not always won by the most upstanding citizens. So just like with canals, just like with railroads, just like with electricity, I would submit to you that in all those cases, right, those are the 3 biggest things that happen in terms of technology during those periods. You could see it coming miles away, decades before the flood crested. And it's the great irony, really, of all technology industries that everything that is really important has always been dead obvious in hindsight. Dead obvious. Not a confusion at all. You don't say, God, I wonder how that happened. Right? You never say that. You never say that. And so it begs the question, right? It says, why is it? Why does that happen? And the answer is, I think, that ideas and insights travel much faster than actual products, right? Products are kind of messy, they're complicated, they don't always work right the first time. You got to ship them, you have to install them, you have to service them, you got to move them around, you got to learn how to use them, right? Whereas the idea, that can move pretty quickly. And so out in Silicon Valley, they have a way of saying it. They say electrons, which you use today to, share ideas, move much faster than atoms, which you use to make products, right? And because atoms, physical things, have inertia. They take up space. They need to be moved around. Right? And that is really the core of the issue about why it takes so long. And so, in the end, you would say, well, then the ideas must be really valuable. And I would say, unfortunately not. If ideas were valuable, professors would be paid more, philosophers would be rich, right? But that's not true. That's not what happens at all in any society. That never happens. What happens? What happens is that the rewards tend to go to people who do something with the ideas. Turns out ideas are a dime a dozen. There's lots of good ideas out there. We are not short ideas. We're not even short discoveries and insights. You would say, oh, well, of course there's a lot of bad ideas. I'm telling you, there's a lot of good ideas. What we're short on is implementation, execution. Somebody will need to put their hand up and say, good idea, I'm going to go do that. I'm going to go hire the people, I'm going to go build an institution, I'm going to go create a building, I'm going to go build a business, whatever it is, I'm going to go do it. That turns out to be the hard and incredibly valuable part. In medicine, you would call it translation. You would say, okay, somebody wrote a paper about a molecule that in a mouse cures the mouse's cancer. And could you take that paper to the hospital and cure Granny? No, you couldn't, right? So if you want to cure Granny, right, you've got to take that idea, test it, find a drug, create a therapy that you can test in humans that demonstrates that, yeah, that's how we cure Granny of cancer or Alzheimer's or any of these other debilitating diseases that might be out there. You have to go translate the insight of the discovery into an actual therapy. So that's one. In the academic world, you talk about it as engineering or applied science. About, okay, it's not just a paper, it's not just a talk. We're actually going to go build something that does this, where there's some hope that either a student or a professor or a company might want to actually make one of these things and sell it to people. Now, it's also the way, it's the reason why online learning, as good as it is, and as important a step forward in complementing what we do, is never going to be the whole story, as long as we all continue to live and work in the physical world. Because you can't just live online. You're going to have to relate to people. So I think the most successful future strategies will have an important hybrid. So let's kind of move forward. We kind of had a little look back to give ourselves a frame of reference. Let's talk about what's really affecting us now. Let's start with modern computing. Digital sciences are really the story of the 20th century. There has been no innovation as big, as important, and that has had as breathtaking an impact on all of our lives. The basic precursor dates from, there's lots of, they had programmable looms, by the way, where they used paper tapes. They had lots of mechanical calculating machines. But the real modern computing starts in World War II, where they built machines for really weapons design and cryptography, breaking codes. That was really the heart of it. And the first commercial computer was introduced in the UK, although very small volume. First mass-produced machines were introduced in the United States in the early 1950s. And by mass-produced, I mean they sold dozens. The machines was Univac, IBM, and the machines cost, in today's dollars, $5 to $10 million a pop. So the only people who bought them was big research institutes, the government, right, and the Defense Department. Those are the people who would buy, those big machines. And so In the early 1960s, though, there was a very, very important innovation, which was the semiconductor. Okay? And the semiconductor, there are two guys. This guy, Kirby at Texas Instruments and Robert Noyce at Fairchild Semiconductor. Both were working on integrated circuits, came to call microchips. The big difference is that Noyce used silicon as his substrate, whereas TI used germanium. Suffice to say, silicon won, the rest is history, and by the way, highly relevant here for the state of Maine, Betty Noyce was Robert Noyce's wife and generously set up and endowed the Liberate Foundation. Of course, Orson Welles is here tonight. Where's Owen? Somewhere tonight. So people of Maine have benefited from this innovation for a long time. But this is what allowed the creation of supercomputers and mainframes in the 1960s. This was the big breakthrough, right? Because you have much, much higher density. Now you're building hundreds, thousands of machines. Machines are now 1 to 5 million a pop. Now you've got something, now you've really got something going. And without getting too nerdy, it's just useful to think about what's happened from here, because if we just pay attention for a minute, I guarantee you that even if you haven't been paying attention up till now, you can tell what's going to happen next. Right? This is just like the canals, just like the railroads, just like electrification. It's dead obvious what's happening now. Right? So first machines, needed a whole room, cost 10 million bucks. Next machines, size of a car. Right? Those are the mini computers. Those cost under $1 million bucks, and people sold tens of thousands of those. Next machines, 1990s, personal computers. Those cost $2,000 to $5,000. They were the size of a box. We sold tens of millions of those. Okay, so a pattern emerging? Yes, there's a pattern emerging, and the pattern's emerging because the price of semiconductors continues to go down, down, down. The size of the memory, the processing units, and all the communications hardware continues to get smaller and smaller and more capable, more capable. And so what happens is that it gets cheaper, gets more pervasive, and it gets into more things. All right, so by 1990, right, think about 1990, we now have PCs everywhere. Is it obvious what's going to happen next? If you had something that was the size of a room, then it was the size of a car, then it was the size of a box, is the next thing going to be bigger or smaller? Smaller. Is the next thing going to be more expensive or less expensive? Less expensive. Is the next thing going to be more capable or less capable? More capable. And so we get laptops, tablets, so on and so forth, right? Was that a big insight that was coming next? No, it's not a big insight at all. And so once we get to, that's 2000, once we get to 2010, what do we get? We get this. Okay. We get this guy. When was the iPhone introduced? Anyone know? Remember when you bought your first iPhone? It was announced in 2007, but the App Store didn't really open until 2008. Classic Steve Jobs, right? Wasn't really ready, but we could start marketing it. So 2008. That makes the iPhone 10 years old. Now, can you really imagine living your life without a smartphone? Right? So what has happened in that 10 years? Photography industry, camera industry, gone. Music industry, totally turned upside down. Book industry, totally turned upside down. Phone industry, collapsed. Right? What happened to Motorola? Who are they? What happened to Nokia? Where are they? Gone. Boom. Right? Giant billion-dollar companies, poof, disappeared. And so you think about it, you think about what was the difference between this and the iPhone 7 last year? A little bit better camera, right? No big deal. Right? So in 1 year, hardly anything changes. But in 10 years, everything changes. And that's the important thing to think about as you look at these big technology trends, which is if you take too small a slice, you can't see what's really going on. But if you take a 10-year slice, right, in 10 years, everything can change. And by the way, everything will. Just as it has between 1950 and 1960, 1960, 1970, 1970, 1980, 1980, 1990, 2000 to 2010. All right, and so here we are, we're in 2010, and we've got these machines that are significantly more capable than the supercomputers and the mainframes of the 1960s. Better communication, cheaper, smaller, blah, blah, blah. What's coming next? Do you think in 2020 that the next generation of devices is going to be bigger or smaller? Smaller, for sure, right? For sure it's going to be smaller. And instead of costing, these cost, $200 to $1,000. What is it going to cost? It's going to cost a few dollars. Just take it down, right? 10 million becomes 1 million, 1 million becomes 10,000, 10,000 becomes 1,000, 1,000 becomes 200, right? The next generation of devices aren't actually going to be devices. The next generation of devices are going to be completely embedded, right? And we're going to sell, instead of hundreds of millions, how many of these do you think there are out there? Billions. Exactly. Billions. There are more phones in India than toilets. I don't say that to be pejorative. I say that to just understand how pervasive the new technology is. Not like toilets aren't a good invention. They're a good invention. You've got to have a lot of them, right? But bam, this came along. It's so important, we have a ton of them. And so the next generation is going to be, I guarantee you, 100%, take it to the bank. It's going to be smaller, it's going to be cheaper, and it's going to be more capable. But there is nothing smaller than this. There is no smaller device. All right? So what happens is the next generation of computing is everything's a computer. Your car's a computer. How many semiconductors do you think you have in your car today? Any guesses? Yeah, a typical car today will have 300 semiconductors in it. More than your computer. Right? So your washing machine, your clothes, obviously, what else? Everything. You don't have to pick anything. Everything is going to have a semiconductor in it. Absolutely everything. Right? Everything will be instrumented. Everything will communicate. All the medical devices. No one would think about selling a medical device that doesn't report back to the doctor. That would be crazy. It'll be a form of malpractice. Right? Lawyers are going to sue people who don't put semiconductors in the thing because it's irresponsible. You could do that. Why wouldn't you do that? That works much better. Right? Planes, trains, cars, absolutely everything. Your seats will have this, so they'll know how many people are in the seat. Why would you have to guess? Can tell you. Right? Baby blankets. Why not? Why guess whether your kid's sleeping, not sleeping? Right? You want to know that. Right? All of those things are going to be instrumented. And so, if you think that we're at the end of the digital sciences age, you are wrong, wrong, wrong. Because not only are we not at the end, we are right on the precipice of the most important part of what's going on. Because we are right now looking at, because once things become super cheap, now in the sense, think about it this way. Processing, memory, and networking are now essentially free on the margin. Right? When you walk into a Starbucks, you expect there to be Wi-Fi. Right? You walk into an airport, you expect there to be Wi-Fi. Of course you have there airport. All right, so what that means is that going forward, we're right on the cusp, right on the precipice of an automation and artificial intelligence age where there is going to be automation everywhere. And it is going to be super disruptive, right? Way more disruptive than the technology to date. And sort of, here's a little bit of a way to think about it, which is McKinsey, when they do this, McKinsey, one of the big strategy consulting firms, they believe that by 2030, that's not far away, right? Less than 12 years away. 2030, 50% of jobs worldwide are going to be affected by automation. In the United States, which is relatively more advanced than on average, 23% of all job content is going to be affected by automation. Some jobs much more than others. There's probably 10 or 15% that are in, immediate jeopardy. Some much less. But just think for a minute, right? If you think about some categories, 2 million long-haul truckers. There will be no long-haul truckers in our kids' generation. There's 1 million warehouse workers. Picking up any kind of predictable physical labor is going to be at risk. Stocking shelves, anything that looked like that. 400,000 welders and solderers. 300,000 taxi drivers and chauffeurs. I mean, the list goes on, but you kind of get the picture. And by the way, it's not just blue-collar workers, right? Let's take radiology. It is already the case that artificial intelligence does a better job, more accurate job, and a faster job reading scans than most radiologists. It's just a matter of time before radiologists will be in a quality control mode as opposed to taking primary responsibility for doing scans. Financial advisors, right? As people start moving more of your portfolios to ETFs and things like that, that's all gonna be done. Think about monitoring, portfolio rebalancing, risk assessment. That's all done today better by computers than by people. Credit analysis, way better by the computer, right? So there's lots of cases on the white collar side where that's also going to happen. And the good news is that most observers think that the new technology will create more new jobs than we're going to lose. But those jobs are going to have much higher average education requirement, and it won't necessarily be the case that the people who lose their jobs are going to be in the right place or have the right skill set to get the new job, which puts, I think, a big onus on society to figure out how to manage through that transition, because the dislocation is going to be large, it's going to be real, and it's going to exacerbate an existing set of problems that we have socially in terms of inequality of income distribution. But let me just tell you one story. It's always better to have a real example. So 30 years ago, there was a big wave of ATM installations. In fact, my wife, Barb, was in charge of ATMs at Shawmut and then Bank at Boston. And what do you think happened when we put a lot of ATMs in? What do you think happened to tellers? You needed less tellers in the bank when you put the ATM in. But there's a secondary effect. It turns out that if you put in ATMs in a bank, it's much cheaper to run the bank branch. And so what banks did is they opened many more branches. And so while each bank branch needed fewer tellers, the fact that there were so many more branches actually increased the demand for tellers. But what happened? In the old days, the teller, largely clerical function, where you're counting money inbound and dispensing it out, right? Now, the function is more of a sales and marketing function. And so, again, it's a very good example of what I'm talking about with automation, where you still have tellers, still have banks, but what they do, the job content, automation forced a dramatic change in what the job content was for those tellers. And that's going to happen in occupation, and occupation, and occupation. Now, we can despair about, all these things coming, but I would just point out a few things. One is that we've been through this before. 1850s, 60% of America worked on farms. Turn of the century, it was a little under 40%. Today, how many people work in agriculture today? Anyone know? Percentage of employment? Yeah, it's between 1 and 2%. Okay, it's 1.8% current. Okay? Under 2% population works in agriculture. And of course, it is the result. It's not that we're producing less food, right? It's not that we have less land under cultivation. It's that we are massively automated and dramatically more productive than when people were walking behind plows with oxen. Right? Just a way better way to do it. But it meant all those people got displaced, initially to manufacturing, trade, and services. But more recently, we've gone from having, in 1970, we had 26% of America worked in manufacturing. What's the number today? Less than 10. Now, not unrelatedly, in China, okay, if you want to forget 1850, right, you go, it's 1850, forget that. 1990 to 2015, China took a third of its population out of agriculture into manufacturing and trade. A third of the population. An astounding movement. Well, we're going to have to do a version of that. If you think about 23% of all job content being affected by automation in the next 10 to 20 years. So we're going to have some similar adjusting to do. Now, I didn't scare everyone, and it's not as if, cloud computing, AI, galloping automation aren't enough. It turns out that's not all. It's like Ginzu knives. Oh my God, there's other things, right? So the digital economy is really big. It's an incredibly important part of our economy. Is it the biggest part of our economy? No, it's not. It's the second biggest. What is the biggest sector of the U.S. economy? Any takers? Healthcare, that's right. Healthcare is the largest sector of the economy. 14% of people are employed there, and it's about 18% of GDP because the things they do there are a little pricey. But think of it, 14% total employment. Is it growing? Fast? Not only is it the largest sector of the economy, it is the fastest growing sector of the economy over the last 10 years, growing faster than any other sector. And guess what? It is also projected in the next 10 years to be the fastest growing sector. So how important is healthcare? Super important. All right. When was the last major technology revolution in healthcare? Many people believe that the last big thing in healthcare took place in 1850. Louis Pasteur, germ theory, and basically the whole idea that when you get sick, it's little bugs that are causing the problem, right? It's not the miasma in the air, which was the leading theory at the time, right? And that got proven. This is pasteurization phase. Now, to be fair, I'm kind of overstating to make a point. Vaccines have been pretty helpful. Anesthesia, pretty helpful. Antibiotics, fantastic. Birth control pills. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that have come along that have been terrific, but they are not, I would not describe them as platform technologies on which great waves of innovation then happen. Well, we're at that stage now. And the fuse, it was a long fuse, got lit in 1953 when Watson and Crick discovered the double helix in DNA. They discovered that, here is the software that controls who we are, how we grow, and how we replicate. Up until that point, no one knew. No one knew that. But it took quite a while for us to figure out. They said, we have this little thing. And it turns out that the DNA is quite complicated. It turns out that you get 6 billion strands of this DNA kind of thing. So it's really 3 billion pairs, 3.2 billion pairs of DNA strands. Well, it takes a while to figure out what's going on there. Right? So go forward a few decades, chickadee, chickadee, chickadee. And finally, in 2003, we sequenced the genome simply being all of your genes and all the underlying DNA. Right? You've got 3 billion of these base pairs. You've got about 20,000 genes that code for proteins. And we finally sequenced the whole thing so that we had a complete map of all the genes. Now, we didn't know what they all did. In fact, we didn't know what most of them did. But we, for the first time, had a map showing everything. The budget for that was $3 billion to sequence the first genome. Now, let's assume it was the US government, so the $3 billion really only cost $1 billion. We spent 3, but we really only needed to spend $1 billion. All right? Well, amazingly, here's what's going on again. 4 years later, 2007, you can sequence an entire genome for $10 million. Chickadee, chickadee, chickadee. Last year, you can sequence a genome for $1,000. And what is happening for the first time in medicine is the same thing that revolutionized computing, which is our understanding of the human body is now computational. We understand digitally what is going on, and our understanding is now moving forward at the rate we can kind of compute that understanding. And I don't want to overstate it because there's tons of real research and science and stuff to go around it, but the actual substrate, the semiconductor, which is sort of the sequencing, that kind of key driver is dropping. Next year, right, next year, the price of a sequence will be the same as an X-ray in the hospital. In 2020, a sequence is going to cost about $100. And then, go forward, right, it becomes just like the semiconductor, it's free. It's approximately free. Costs as much as a Band-Aid. Costs as much as an injection. Costs as much as saline. It's just cheap. And so everyone is sequenced, everyone understands it. And to give you a frame of reference for this, the whole big driver on semiconductors was Moore's Law, where the price of a semiconductor dropped in half every 2 years. The price of sequencing is dropping in half every 6 months. It's going 3 to 4 times faster than the thing that revolutionized computing. And I would argue that's not the biggest change, right? And because what that helps us do, it helps us understand what's in there, but it doesn't necessarily allow us to fix it. In 2012, we had a really, really fundamental, it may be the most profound scientific, certainly it's the most profound scientific breakthrough of the 21st century, but certainly of my lifetime, which is CRISPR, the ability to edit genes. Forget what the individual, what it all stands for. What it means is that for the first time, scientists can go in, look at all the DNA, pick out a gene that may work, may not be working, and take it out, or move it, or insert a gene that you're missing, or change the order. So pause to think about what that means. Think about what it means for diagnostics. Right? You can go in now, molecular, you can say, all right, well, I understand what's working and what's not working. Think what it means for drug discovery, right? In terms of what you're building. You can build something that works exactly for the person who has this particular genetic profile and know this particular molecule will do this exact thing for this exact gene. Right? Because you have that level of understanding. But there are big ethical issues, right? So think about what that means, right? So now we can gene edit. And you'd say, well, okay, it would be obvious that if you were born and you had a dangerous gene, you had a test, you would say, hey, please, take that out. I don't want that bad gene. Let's get it out of there. Why would I risk Alzheimer's, APOE? Why would I risk cystic fibrosis? Why would I risk blindness? Why would I risk any of these things that today are already known? They already know what causes it, because it's simple. It's one, it's one gene. Right. Let's take it out. Simple. Not so hard. Now, by the way, most things are what's called polygenic, right? Which is there are multiple genes interacting. They don't really have any idea of the processes and pathways, and we're far away from understanding. But there are some, including a bunch of rare diseases, where we can do that. And by the way, they have done in plants and animals tons of things, right? They've got a mosquito that doesn't carry malaria. They have a tomato with no seeds so that you don't need to pollinate it. They've got a goat that grows extra long hair for cashmere. They've got a pig that's super muscular like Arnold Schwarzenegger so that you get more meat. Right? All of these things have been done today. A whole bunch of plants that are more insect-proof, that grow faster, need less water, blah, blah, blah. So all that stuff's done. So the really interesting thing is, what are you going to do with humans? And on the human side, you say, well, all right, we can take out the bad gene. That's not so hard. Okay, done. So now you say the question, well, all right, we took out the bad gene, but while I'm here, maybe I'd like to get a little touch-up. How about, we're thinking about having a baby. I'd like to have a little bit taller. Maybe a little more athletic. A little smarter. A little stronger. How do we feel about that? Now people are kind of curling their, I'm not sure about that. I don't know about that. Right? Now, here's the really big issue. This, I think, by the way, is going to be the big ethical question of our time. I think this will be the abortion debate times 10, which is we now have, with gene editing, the ability not just to fix you or me or my kid, but you have the ability to shape the human germline. You can actually affect evolution. We no longer have to rely on random mutations and the normal variation that you get in reproduction to run a breeding program, either for plants or animals or for people. Right? In other words, instead of doing that gene therapy on me, we do that gene therapy on sperms and eggs, and now we can change permanently who we are as humankind. That was such a scary notion. Remember, this was only invented in 2012. By the way, bacteria have been doing it for a long time, but we just figured it out in 2012. And people slapped themselves on the forehead, the scientists did, had a big conference, as scientists do, and decided, you know what, we need to have a moratorium on this. And so right now, there's a moratorium. But I would simply observe that no fundamental technology breakthrough has ever sat on the shelf for long. And it's only a matter of time before someone blinks. Because it's not that difficult to do. Much easier than making an atomic bomb, by the way, right? Right? I mean, a good grad student can do this. And so it is entirely based on self-restraint that we're here. All right, so, oh my God, we got this wave of automation. We have all this gene editing. We've got, sequencing. Does it feel like today is a little different than 30 years ago? Yes, it does. Yeah. I would argue that we're in a very different place today than we were 30 or 50 or 100 years ago because things are moving much more quickly. There are two things that are different. Three things. Thing one, I would describe it as the technology river has overflown its banks. We're at flood stage, right? We've got sequencing, we've got functional genomics, we've got complex genetics, we've got computational biology, we've got gene editing, we've got automation, we've got artificial intelligence. I mean, it's just absolutely everywhere, and it's coming like a freight train. The second thing that's going on is the innovation is happening faster. And the innovation is happening faster because the point we made earlier. right? In the old days, most of the innovation, you had to build it. Edison, when he was making his light bulb, needed to try 1,000 different filaments. But if you're running the sequencer, you just fire it up and let it rip. If you're running a computer, right, you can operate virtually, as you're moving electrons around, right? So the innovation can happen faster, right? It's a much faster thing. And maybe a way to think about it is, I did a little chart. I was going to show you a chart, but I'm just going to tell you, which is, sometimes it's easier to, instead of talking about it abstractly, how long does it take to get 100 million households? Telephone. How long did it take for the telephone? Anyone know? It took 75 years to get 75 million households. How long did it take for personal computer? Anyone know? 20 years, personal computer, to get to 75 million households. How long did it take for the cell phone? 16 years. Sort of an early, slow start because it was super expensive. How long did it take for Facebook to get to 100 million households? 4 years and change. How long did it take for Instagram to get to 100 million households? 24 months. How long did it take for Pokemon Go, which is an augmented reality game your kids were probably all playing last year? How long did that take? 28 days. Less than a month. And by the way, that wasn't something they gave away free. Pokemon Go makes $10 million a day. That's a $3.5 billion a year run rate. So it's a very, very important economic activity. All right, so because of one, much more technology everywhere, just pervasiveness, and because of two, it's coming much faster. Finally, Jim can breathe a sigh of relief because now rapid learning is now really, really important. Whew! Right? In a way that it wasn't back in the day. If you think back to Dell. Mike Dell never went to college. Bill Gates went for a year and left. Larry Ellison didn't go to college. Right? Mark Zuckerberg didn't go to college. Terrible. Right? They've all suffered acutely. Right? Steve Jobs didn't go to college, didn't finish college. Today, who's the richest guy in the world? It'd be Jeff Bezos. And Jeff Bezos did go to college. He went to a good college, and he studied computer science and electrical engineering. And I would tell you that I think, based on how fast things are going, how complex the new technologies are, that we're done seeing the kid in the garage. In fact, if you think about on the life science side, I don't know a single person in a position of authority in the life sciences that does not have an advanced degree in their field of study. Right? No one. MD, PhD, all of them. Right? Because it's that complicated. Right? It's that complicated. So the good news is, we need more, bigger, better, faster learning. Now, but there's a rub. There's a rub. We don't need the kind that you're selling right now.
Can't you stop the talk?
No. And so, maybe college matters after all, but I would say that there's an issue. Because that college has, in the same way that employees and the same way consumers have to keep pace with that acceleration, so too does higher education, right? Higher education does many things well. Move quickly is not one of them, right? That is not the kind of key feature of universities. But that's going to be one of the things that distinguishes successful universities from not. But there's one other, there are a couple of other things. One is, I think the big problem of our time, in addition to all the tech stuff, is access. I don't think that there is fair access to the coursework that matters most for most people's future. I was fortunate, my family was fortunate, most of you have been fortunate to do that. But if you look across society, most people don't have access to the kind of education that's available, and I am arguing will be necessary to lead a successful life when the twin drivers of our economy are digital sciences and modern life sciences. Right? It's just not, we're dramatically underinvested as a nation, and particularly as a state, in those two areas. And so, to oversimplify, going forward, let me cite 5 things that I think universities, that will distinguish universities who do well. Doesn't mean they're all going to go away because they're enduring institutions, but here are the 5 things that I think will matter. One is to improve access for all kinds of students. And the way I would say it is that I think ability is randomly distributed and broadly distributed, but access is not. And if you look across America, the only institutions that welcome poor people today, I would argue, are churches, military, and prisons. And that, I just think, is completely unacceptable. And universities should be one of those places. So I think we need to do more there. Second thing, I think you have to increase the curriculum focus on digital and life sciences. And most good schools do some of that, but they don't do nearly enough, and particularly they don't do enough for what's coming over the horizon. Right? It's all backward looking. And so kids get out and they're really not ready for the best new jobs. Right? So we can get to do more. Now, it's a hard problem for universities because they can't stop doing anything. They can only add to it. Right? So it's hard to stop things. Decrease size of departments. Stop doing things entirely. And yet, if you think about what's going on with employment, right? Huge sectors of the economy changing employment occupation requirements, that's what we need to do, right? We have to be able to do that. So you have to think about what are things that technology is going to obsolete, what are things that are best done online, et cetera. The third is that we need to integrate leadership training and the ability to work as a team. There is a myth going around that in the technical world that it's these sort of geniuses in closets, right? The antisocial brainiac. And nothing could be further from the truth, right? All big problems, every product that you know and love was built by a team of people. Even Edison, brilliant inventor, had his whole team of muckers, as he called them, who were with him and built the light bulb, built the phonograph, built the batteries, built the electrical system. All of those things were done as a team, right? And so we need to be teaching people how to work as a team, because once they get out in the marketplace, they're not sitting by themselves. They're working as part of a team. Why wouldn't we teach them leadership? Military teaches people leadership, right? Seminaries teach people leadership. Why don't universities teach people leadership? It should be a standard part of what we do. The fourth thing is we need to embrace what I call continuous flow learning. Most universities, most colleges, have a spring semester and a fall semester. And people are on campus 13 weeks or so, and the rest of the time, the place is largely empty, right? Is there any factory you know of that operates half-time? Not successfully, no, right? But here's a system that is set up, right? The learning factory only works half the time. Right? It's completely ludicrous that should be the case, right? In other words, it's not like a prison where you go, serve 4 years, you do your time, and then you get out, right? It should be more like a restaurant where you go, have a satisfying intellectual meal, and when you're done, you can leave. That's the way it should work, right? You should measure what you're learning and be done and get out of there, right? The last thing is it just seems so obvious, is the universities need to double down and make an honest-to-God commitment to technology in support of the pedagogies that they're employing. And that's not saying that the technology is more important than the professors. It's not. It's saying that it's malpractice for the universities not to provide the level of support that exists in every other industry. There's more technology in a Walmart than there is in a typical university classroom. There's more technology in the fryer machine at McDonald's, which runs on artificial intelligence, than there is in a classroom. There's typically more technology in the kid's backpack that they turn off during class to have their kind of medieval moment in the 19th century with their class, with their professor, right? And that's crazy, right? And that's something that we need and we'll have to rectify. So finally, it strikes me that these changes, I think they're more than good ideas. I think they're more than useful improvements. I think about them as moral imperatives because this next generation of students needs that. And the old system can't deliver it. So you're going to have some version of the new system deliver this for people. And I would tell you that when you get a chance, you got to fight for that. I would also tell you that it's not going to happen overnight. It won't happen in a year. But just like with the cell phone, get started, because while not much can happen in 1 year, a lot can happen in 10. So I think it's time to get started. Thank you very much. Appreciate you having me. Your call, yep. Yeah. So here, sure.
So I think what we're going to do is just take a couple of questions. Dave has kindly agreed to take a couple of questions, so please, anyone? Who wants to go first?
Well, that's a complicated thing. The question was, if healthcare is so important, why is it so expensive, and why is it poorly delivered? And it's a fair point that says that what's the real story in America is that healthcare is delivered quite well in most places, but in places where it's not, it's third world. And so the average is lower than it should be. But if you're in a, if you get to a major medical center, you're going to get good health care almost any place in the United States. On pricing, the biggest issue on pricing in the United States, stuff, it's not defensive medicine, it's not, that's a factor, it's not lawyers, that's a factor. The biggest thing is we pay our doctors dramatically more than anywhere else in the world. 1. And 2, we pay way more for drugs, and 3, we pay more for medical devices. That's the simple answer, and if we can live with less of that, then we can get the price down. And molecular medicine, which is going to be way better and way more efficient.
So if you had an 18-year-old daughter, what would you counsel her to go into? And I don't mean the field, but I mean the function. Should she be a scientist, a coder, a marketer, a leader, something else, an engineer? What would you advise?
Well, I don't think that you're necessarily choosing between each of those things. So I would first say, whatever field she chooses, she should feel like a leader. 1. 2, I would steer people who had the proclivity. In other words, I wouldn't try to turn a poet into a physicist, but if I had somebody who liked science, liked technical fields, I would for sure try to steer them to some form of digital sciences or life sciences, in the same way as if I had a kid who enjoyed music, I'd encourage them to take piano lessons, right? In other words, definitely sample. And that I'd be much less focused on career, because that feels like this horrible life commitment, right? That's like picking the husband, right? I wouldn't talk like that at all. I would talk about, you should really do some dating. That would be good. And to try some things and just try to match it up. It's very unlikely that any one job will be the same, right? She's likely to have 10 jobs and have that evolve dramatically over the course of her adult life. We still need English teachers, we still need writers, we still need philosophers. Don't take the wrong message here. I'm just saying that, this is where the growth is.
Could you talk a little bit more about how the cost of sequencing the genome will change medicine and perhaps change each of our lives?
Well, it's hard to say exactly how. And the fair qualification I should make to all of my grand pronouncements about being able to see a technology trend is you can see the trend quite clearly. What's hard to do is to predict the particular little vortices and which companies and the exact timing for things will go. But I think that the way to think about it is the first two things that will be dramatically affected are drug discovery and diagnostics. Those will be the two big areas that will change, because it's just like the introduction of the microscope is all of a sudden you say, we now know where to look. We can figure out what's probably causing this. So those will be the two big things that go on immediately. But eventually, let me say this. I think that we've built the last hospital bed in America. It'd be insane to build another hospital bed. We have way too many beds. And that in the same way that with surgery, people have discovered, it's much cheaper to do most surgery anywhere except in a hospital. So if you're going to have transplant surgery, something big and complicated, sure, go to the hospital. But if you're going to have, a mole removed, you can go to a derm suite at the surgery center. If you're going to, have your knee done, if you're going to get a ACL repaired, if any of those sorts of things, those common things, all have come out of the hospital, well, the same thing's going to happen with a lot of molecular medicine. You don't need to be in the hospital for many of those things.
Got a question on Facebook. What can academia drop to make these new modalities possible for our students?
What can you adopt? I'm sorry.
What can academia drop to make these new modalities possible for our students?
Let me refer that to my colleague.
I plead the fifth.
That's going to be hard. That's the hard call, right? Which is, what is it that you stop doing? But the essence of strategy is not deciding what to do. That's almost always obvious. The essence of strategy is making the hard decision about what you stop doing, right? That's the hard call. That's what the big decision is. That's where the consensus needs to be built. And oftentimes it won't be stopping entirely, but resizing to get it to get the right size, right? Right now, MIT has more Nobel laureates in its economics department than students. Good for the students, but maybe not so good for MIT.
So thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. And you certainly highlighted for us how much man has embraced science and our scientific capacity. And I want to reflect a little bit on this lecture series, which also looks at the ethics of business. And when you were speaking about the advances with genetics and genomics, you commented that we've taken a pause now and that the scientists have agreed we need to stop and think. And I'm sitting here thinking about, just because we have the capacity or the knowledge to do something, does that mean we should do it? And to me, that's a perfect marriage with the title of this, which is the Business Ethics Lecture.
Sure.
So although you haven't spoken much about philosophy and right and wrong and good and evil, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts to share with us about that.
Well, first of all, I think that in the case of gene editing on the germline, the scientists stopped not just to contemplate, but because they were rightly terrified, right? I mean, I would say it's like all of a sudden realizing that we have all atomic bombs and that we could radically change not just society, but humankind. I mean, who we are. And I can't think of a larger or more fraught ethical issue than that. And so the future of genomic medicine will need to, hand in hand, go forward with a set of ethical decisions, and we're going to have to make it up because there is no infrastructure or framework for how to think about it because we didn't know we could do these things. So it's all brand new. So great news if you're a philosophy major, there's an opportunity here to really make a contribution.
Why don't we take one more question? Is Scott up here? Oh, she asked, okay, good. Oh, we have one question back here, okay.
Okay, you can hear me. So I have a question as it relates to the idea of a limiting factor, perhaps. So as trends proceed, maybe with respect to canals or railroad or electricity, eventually there's a limiting factor that slows it down, might inhibit the development as it relates to that trend. And so we're entering a time where I'm a young parent, I have a 3-year-old, I'm looking at, there are trends existing right now that may have limiting factors that we haven't identified. And so how do we look to the future with an attention towards the limiting factors that might arise within that trend's lifespan, whether it's electricity or energy access,
Yeah.
whatever that limiting factor might be, at some point we have to be cognizant as a trend develops. Is there a death, trap along the way as it relates to resource to continue that trend? So how do you explore the identification of those kind of traps?
Well, first I would say the place where I would be most worried about it is when I think about the geosphere and kind of environmental sciences, which is not my area of expertise because there is a certain amount of water, a certain amount of carbon dioxide, a certain amount of oxygen, so forth. That's a finite system. What I would say is that in almost all of the economic spheres, people who have bet on limitations have bet and lost. And that if there's one thing that humankind is really good at, is figuring out problems and getting around them. And so, if you take the idea, for instance, of Moore's Law, people have been saying, we're about to reach the end of Moore's Law for my entire adult career, right? When I first got out of school in the late 70s, they said, party's almost over because we can't keep going down every 2 years. Can't happen. They said that in 2000. They said it in 2010. They're saying it now, and I would bet against it every single time. And so I think I would just caution you I would just caution people not to bet against creativity and ingenuity because it's the thing that has made the society as great as it is. That's not a reason to ignore the problems that also exist, because we should go solve those. But the idea that these powerful trends are going to come to grinding halts hasn't happened yet. It's usually some other new thing that's better, like railroads to canals rather than running out of place to dig canals.
So on that, I think we want to wind it up. I want to thank David Roux so much for coming and for all of the comments. And
Thank you very much.
this is it's a crystal lighthouse. So,
Fantastic, great.
because just something to remind you
Thank you
of
very
Maine
much.
when
All
you're
right.
when you're not here. And please join us for a reception, everyone. Look forward to continuing the
Does the reception
conversation.
include cocktails?
Does the reception include cocktails? Holly, it does include cocktails. Yes, it does. So,
Key information.
absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much.